All right, I'd like to welcome you all back for this next session where we are really interesting topic of moving beyond safety surveillance. You've heard today about a lot of things that are going on with the Sentinel initiative and related efforts, especially using distributed data for questions and analyses related to real-world data systems. We heard a lot about the robustness of the Sentinel data infrastructure, the validation tools, the communication tools, really the whole portfolio. Now we're going to transition into a discussion of how this infrastructure is being used as a foundation for broader efforts to address evidence generation needs. This is an issue that, as you've heard about multiple times today, is we think a very urgent one for improving healthcare outcomes, improving value of care, and improving many other aspects of how our health system functions. What we're going to do this afternoon is walk through some current examples and some current as well as emerging opportunities to further leverage the rich infrastructure that started with safety surveillance at FDA and Sentinel, but now has extended well beyond that with some really impressive potential. Very pleased to be joined for this discussion by Melissa Robb, the Associate Director for Regulatory Affairs in the Office of Medical Policy at CDER. David Martin, the liaison to the Reagan-Udall Foundation IMEDS program, also based at CDER. Robert Reynolds, Vice President and Global Head for Epidemiology at Pfizer. Rachel Florence, Program Director of the Research Infrastructure Program at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. Bill Murray, President and CEO of the Medical Devices Innovation Consortium. And Catherine Myers, the Director of the Office of Clinical and Regulatory Affairs at the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. These are all leaders of evidence generation activities that, as we've said, start with, in some ways, but extend well beyond the kinds of ideas and infrastructure going into Sentinel. So we're going to hear from each of them in turn about these extensions and the potential for further work, and then have some more time for discussion. I'll start off with Melissa Robb, who's been involved in some broad efforts out of FDA for evidence generation.
Thanks, Mark. So I guess I wanted to talk about kind of two different scopes of activities that FDA has been thinking about, and as they relate to Sentinel. So I think one thing is really about how we can better take advantage of the Sentinel data infrastructure and use it more broadly within the work that we do at FDA. And the second thing is, how can we collaborate with others to take advantage of the investments they've made in similar evidence generation systems to make the investments that each group, FDA and whoever we're partnering with, more valuable and more economical. So the actual collaborations, I think that a lot of the people we're collaborating with are here on this panel. So I don't think I'm going to go into them too much, but I want to talk about some of the things that we've been thinking about, broader uses of the Sentinel infrastructure. So you've heard today a lot about how FDA has been using the Sentinel system, has partnered with many different groups, continues to expand the ways that we can use those partnerships and the types of data and the way we can analyze the data to inform Sentinel queries mostly related to safety. And so the focus has always been on optimizing the use of those tools and those data, but it focused on existing data. And I think that there was an acknowledgement that the methods and the data needs to continue to grow, and that will only be to our advantage. But one other area that we've been thinking about is how can we use this infrastructure to better embed different types of techniques such as randomization, where we could get information that wasn't already included in a patient's data. So that would involve an intervention or an interaction with either a patient or provider. And so to kind of separate that program, and I think Rich Maszewski might have mentioned this a bit this morning, we've called that the FDA Catalyst program. And so the big distinction between FDA Catalyst and Sentinel is the nature of an intervention or interaction with a patient. And so seems easy enough, but I'm sure everybody knows that, doing these types of work is very complex. And so what we wanted to do is pick out a pretty basic but important question that we could test this idea of, can we work with these data partners, identify certain cohorts, do an intervention or an interaction, and get meaningful information about that to answer a question. And one of the big concepts that we thought was important is being able to randomize patients and also introducing that. So the first study we've been planning and hoping to launch probably later this spring or early summer is the Impact AFib study. And it's an educational intervention looking at patients who appear to be at risk for certain cardiac events because of their scores and don't appear to be on oral anticoagulant, and sending them and their providers an intervention that would tell them that based on their data, that we looked at their data, it appears that they should be on this medication, that either the patient should talk to their provider, the provider should talk to their patient about it, and seeing if there's a change in the rate of the outcome. And the primary outcome that we're going to be looking at is the prescription. So are there more prescriptions filled in the patients that had the intervention than the control group? And then we also plan, there's some secondary outcomes that will also be looked at, that will look at stroke and different, if they stayed on treatment and did refills, but there's different outcomes. So we're really excited about this because I think this will be a whole new capability that, opening this resource up for FDA uses. And then hopefully, as we're going to talk about today, there's opportunities for others to kind of work and utilize the investment that FDA has done with Sentinel, but using it for other purposes. So the FDA Catalyst activity is just one activity that will broaden how FDA can use it. And I'm going to let David go now, because he has another FDA Catalyst activity to talk about.
Okay. Thanks, Melissa. So I'll pick up where Melissa left off and describe a specific Catalyst activity. And then with the balance of my time, I'll transition to discussing IMEDS, which is separate from the Catalyst activity, but someday might incorporate Catalyst infrastructure. And then Robert will continue after me and continue discussing IMEDS. So before starting, I'd just like to acknowledge that I received funding for the mobile app project from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Trust Fund, which is managed through a competitive process through the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at HHS. So without that office and their support, I wouldn't be speaking to you about this today. The mobile app project is actually not just an app, it's an entire system for incorporating patient-provided data into a distributed database environment. I wanted the initial use case to be drug safety in pregnancy. We've already heard today about how there's little known about, or we know less than we'd like to know about drug safety during pregnancy. And there's important information regarding exposures and outcomes that I think most of us would agree that only the pregnant women can tell us. So, and those things aren't necessarily present in electronic health records. But what we want to do, obviously, is leverage the benefit of the electronic health data and combine it with supplementary input from pregnant women so that we can optimize our surveillance activities. So the next part of this system is the fact that the participants will actually be authenticated and will provide electronic informed consent through the app. And then there's a secure storage environment, which is Federal Information Security Act compliant, and it has 3 servers, one which stores the authentication information, one which stores the questionnaires and active tasks which go out to the pregnant women through the app, and one which stores the responses that we receive. A nice thing about this is that it's going to have a consistent look and feel. If you have an Apple phone or an Android phone, everything, the app programming is actually being done on these frameworks called Apple Research, Apple Research Kit, and Android Research Stack. And so it'll be a consistent look and feel. And then the app, we heard a little bit in the last session about value for patients. It's going to provide some value for patients at the same time with tracking certain things that might be of interest to patients, whether or not they're of interest to the researchers. They may be of interest to the patients and clinicians. And another thing about this is obviously we're designing this such that the programming is such that you can pick up and put this thing down because we all know that, especially those of us with too many children, know that there's constant interruptions, and so you want to be able to engage with your app and maybe not immediately finish and then be able to still finish things later. And so we try to make it as convenient as possible for the patients. The next feature of this is that, from the beginning, while I had a specific use case, I wanted to really think about how this could be more broadly utilized by the FDA. So there's actually an umbrella app that you can see there. Basically, each study fits the app functionally is an umbrella or a gateway, and so that multiple drug safety studies where patients provide input or other types of health outcome studies can actually be hosted by this app, and people can actually, in theory, interact with it over time because there may be certain studies that they would be eligible for and others they would not be. But the sort of scalability is there. And then the last thing is that, in terms of sort of sustainability, you don't really want to have to do completely custom programming every time you want to do a new study. So these images come from the Study Designer, which is basically a secure web-based system that allows investigators to basically modulate many of the elements of a study. And while you might do some custom code to provide some new special features in a study, broadly, you could actually parameterize a number of different studies through this system. So this is kind of I like to call this a transdisciplinary activity. It's really a lot of people from a lot of different disciplines who are engaged in this. Besides myself and Harvard Pilgrim, Boston Technology Company is actually programming the app and really has experience in sort of the app development environment. We have LabKey, which is involved in secure storage for a lot of biomedical data, and this is the first time they've attempted to create this type of repository for this type of data that we have, claims data or electronic healthcare data or data collected from patients through a mobile device. And then, of course, again, thinking of sustainability, we have investigators, because this first topic is related to pregnancy. There's an organization called the Vaccines and Medications and Pregnancy Surveillance System, has a couple of component parts. It's been around for a couple of decades, basically, not necessarily with that name, but the component parts have been around, and the investigators have been involved in working face-to-face with pregnant women for years. So I want to make sure that this was refined, where we take the best lessons from sort of the gold standard of sort of face-to-face clinical research and try to bring it into the app, since the app will have certain advantages with respect to clinical research face-to-face and certain disadvantages. And probably most important is our data partner, which is Group Health. And Group Health will obviously be recruiting the patients, and they will be refining the app as well. They have experience engaging with various patient populations and developing sort of engagement features that refine apps that are not necessarily linked to distributed databases. And finally, they'll be involved in the local analytics. This sort of cartoon or diagram shows you a few key features, and I could sort of try to laser point, like it's like a like an MBA move here or something, a hook shot or something. But right here, this is where the authentication, actually the data partner provides a secure token to the patient, and then the patient authenticates. And then up here, these are secure folders or partitions where basically if you are a health plan member and you're using the app and you're providing information, your information goes to a secure environment that can only be accessed by your health plan. And so this provides scalability for FDA because we can have multiple folders, thus allowing multiple data partners to be involved. And there can be subfolders within those partitions, so there could be multiple studies carried out by one data partner or other data partners. And all of these things are essentially independent of each other. And the final feature, obviously, is that the final crosswalk and analytics occur behind the data partner's firewall, which is sort of in keeping with the Sentinel privacy-sparing traditions. So right now, we're actively engaged in completing the IT infrastructure. This app should be in the hands of patients probably this summer. It's the anticipated timeline, and we'll be back to tell you more. So with the balance of my time, I'll just shift gears completely, talk about a different activity I'm involved in, which is IMEDS. And I know that IMEDS has been introduced by several speakers today. Just as a reminder, it's offered by the Reagan-Udall Foundation. This is the foundation for the FDA. It was set up by the U.S. Congress in 2007. Actually, the same legislation that gave rise to Sentinel gave rise to the foundation. And as you heard before, Sentinel data partners and the Sentinel Operations Center have come together and worked with the foundation to basically make this data available to the public, to organizations from the public. And so IMED sponsors will be able to use modular programs, protocol-based assessments, you've heard that term, or customized studies, or a blended approach that complements FDA ARIA to examine drug safety questions, look at benefit risk by looking at healthcare data that FDA is simultaneously using. And so I think, again, we've really heard all day about the kind of use cases for FDA. I think there are use cases, obviously, on the other side for industry. With the ARIA-like capabilities, you can be proactive if you're industry or a patient organization. You don't have to wait for FDA to decide to ask questions. You can ask questions, or if FDA is asking questions, you might parameterize those questions in a slightly different way. With respect to PMRs, as we heard earlier, there are some situations where ARIA is not sufficient, but with a few add-ons, such as chart review, it might be possible actually to conduct a PMR in IMEDS, and that might be logistically less difficult than starting over and conducting a PMR sort of from the ground up. So one other thing to just kind of mention is that people who are working with IMEDS, they're getting all of the production features of Sentinel sort of available to them. And then obviously we have to structure the activity to fit the need. Another key point about IMEDS is that it doesn't change or alter the regulatory relationship between the FDA reviewing divisions and regulated industry. That's important. It just provides a tool or a pathway that may essentially be sort of increase the evidence generation capabilities that are available. And so I think the last thing is just, some people say, well, why is FDA doing this? And I think that FDA feels that we're very happy with the Sentinel system, and we want to have others be as engaged as possible. We think that the additional input of knowledge, of resources coming in through IMEDS will help build out the underlying infrastructure, and that this will really benefit public health. So appreciate you listening to me as I talked about these two slightly separate topics, and now Robert will give us the industry perspective on IMEDS.
Great, thanks, David. So I'm going to cover two topics. The first is hopefully relatively brief, and it's about Pfizer's experience with the IMEDS pilot. And then the second, I'd like to talk about how I see the unique value of IMEDS and suggest some potential use cases for sponsors moving forward. So, throughout the day, I think we've heard very clearly that Sentinel is very useful to the FDA, that it improves the public health, and that it has a lot of features that are very attractive. And I think that it's clear from what we've heard today that many of these tools can also be used by industry as a complement to the scientific activities that companies carry out. So a key goal of the IMEDS pilot was really to develop first and then test a mechanism by which a stakeholder other than the FDA could access the system. And we did this together with Reagan-Udall Foundation, with Duke, with FDA, with Harvard Pilgrim, as well as the Sentinel data partners. And Pfizer proposed 2 scientific queries. And one query was led by Andrew Bate, and this was a signal refinement query looking at oral contraceptives and VTE. And the second query was led by Rachel Sobel, and this query was looking at could we detect effects of a risk minimization action? So did physicians change their behavior after a label change? And this was looking at a label change associated with PPIs. And we used 2 types of programs. We use the summary tables, which are the sort of basic queries that you heard about from Rich that you might think about as feasibility counts. And we used the level 1 reusable modular programs. We didn't use the more advanced modular programs because the focus was really on let's think about governance and the policies and procedures for how a sponsor accesses this data system. Just a few thoughts on what we found as new users. I think that overall the system is fairly intuitive for people who have been trained in epidemiology and have used electronic healthcare data. I don't think there were really any surprises, big surprises, but it does require significant investment of learning about the system and practice to be able to develop the query and the analytic specifications and then interpret the output. But the good thing is that the data partners and the coordinating center are incredibly helpful, very collaborative to work with, and I think overall we found the process of the pilot really a good experience, and we learned a lot, and it was very interactive, and there was a lot of time given to us to help us get through those initial kind of early stumbling blocks. As I think you heard from Rich, we completed the pilot in 2016. Both of the queries were presented at the International Conference on Pharmacoepidemiology in 2016 as well, and we have plans for publication. So, turning to, actually we heard, the questions we heard earlier couldn't have set this up better. What I've heard from many sponsors is a question of really what are we going to do with this system? Okay, now that it's available to sponsors, how do we use it? And we also heard the question I've heard the most, which is why do we need this when we have access, fairly easy access to many large real-world data sources? So, what's the unique value? And I'm going to try to lay that out at a few points of why I think it's unique. Clearly, this is not going to substitute for every real-world data source that we already use. It's not going to replace Odyssey. It's not going to replace networks that are part of the IMI initiative, for example, networks that have been developed, data networks that have been developed as part of IMI. But it is an incredibly powerful tool, and it has some unique advantages that I think we need to be aware of when we're thinking about safety questions as well as potentially other types of questions. The first is, really, is there any other data system that is this large? This is an incredible amount of data. It includes half of the US population. Second is it uses methods and tools that have been developed over many years and that are trusted by the FDA. It uses the same quality procedure checking as is in Sentinel will be as in IMEDS. There's very good procedures in terms of transparency around the operations, the methods, as well as publication. And we heard from Rich that many of these modules are available publicly by download by going down to the website. I think also very importantly is that some people have an impression that the system, because it is so rapid and because it uses modular programs, is a sort of push button kind of activity. And our experience is it's not like that. Investigators make the key design and analytic decisions, and then the modular programs are used for that speed. So I think it's, with experience, people will understand that, but I think if you're concerned that it's somehow just all automated and there's no thinking involved, well, that wasn't our experience. And then we heard from David, another key aspect of Sentinel and iMeds is that they're intended to be learning systems. So the more users customize and enhance modular programs, the more that are going to be offered to the rest of the community. So everyone's contributing to this development of methods and knowledge over time, and that ultimately benefits all stakeholders. For companies with large epidemiology groups, and this is more like where I'm coming from, my perspective, is that the experience is very collaborative around design and analysis. And I think that epidemiologists in companies are going to be able to bring their experience and knowledge in drug development to the iMed scientific team, and I think that's very valuable from my perspective. But another advantage here for smaller companies who may not have epidemiologists or have very few epidemiologists is that you're able to access the coordinating center and the data partners, and they have a wealth of expertise in epidemiology and biostats and data science. So, no matter where you're coming from in industry, there are really some advantages that you're going to have regardless of where you sit. And then finally, I just want to focus in on what are the actual offerings. So what do the modular programs do? The first we heard from David already is they allow us to look at safety signals in terms of population-based assessment. This is useful post-approval, but it's also useful during drug development. They allow us to conduct drug utilization studies, so you can look at off-label use as well as questions around appropriate use. We heard that there's propensity score matching that we can use for comparison of outcomes among different groups using different drugs. And then there's also this ability to look at a pre and post trends, which can be applied to questions around what are the effects of risk minimization actions. And then I think maybe one of the most compelling is this ability to customize the modular programs as well as epidemiologic studies, and the possibility that those studies or customized modular programs could be placed within iMeds and serve as a post-marketing requirement. And then finally, just to wrap up, I think that we also heard from CBER that there's the possibility of looking at effectiveness, perhaps, and I think in terms of, down the road, as we have more experience in iMeds, hopefully we'll be able to explore the use of that system for looking at effectiveness and potentially even for supporting clinical trials or pragmatic trials, for example. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, Robert, for a lot of ground to cover with some very practical insights based on your recent iMeds experience. I'm going to change gears a little bit now and talk about the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Network that PCORI is supporting, that's adding to this and integrating with this infrastructure. Rachel?
Thanks, Mark. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And so it's a pleasure to be here with this panel and share a little bit about PCORNet, which is sort of a cousin to Sentinel and has the advantage of sharing a coordinating center with Sentinel in the likes of Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. And so in that sense, PCORNet's been able to develop, so both benefit from the experience of Sentinel, but also sort of develop in a slightly different space because it is mainly EHR-based. So I'm going to give you a little brief overview of PCORNet and then talk to you about some of the collaborations we've started this year with Sentinel to really leverage the power of both networks. So the vision of PCORNet is different from Sentinel. The vision for PCORNet is in short, faster, better, cheaper research. So it's really a research network to do clinical research, both observational studies and pragmatic clinical trials. PCORNet is is sponsored and funded by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which is really focused on engagement as a key priority and sort of a key way to engage many different stakeholders, people, patients, families, caregivers, clinicians, health systems, and researchers, obviously, throughout every aspect of the network, from governance to the actual research. PCORNet has infrastructure, tools, and policies to support this rapid, efficient clinical research, and multiple data sources are used. The main source really is EHR data. We are mainly a network of healthcare delivery systems, although we do have some health plans engaged, and we're also piloting patient-generated data and the use of data sources like mobile health. So this is PCORNet, 20 patient-powered research networks. These are mainly disease-specific communities that work to prioritize research agendas and develop and participate in research. The real size of PCORNet is really in the 13 clinical data research networks. There's about 117 institutions across the country. As I said, they're mainly academic medical delivery systems, but we do have federally qualified health centers as well as some integrated delivery systems. They all work together under the guise of a coordinating center, which includes Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, Duke, DCRI, and Genetic Alliance, which is a patient stakeholder driven and led organization. So this is just a quick list of our 20 PPRNs. Many diseases are represented, including a large number of rare diseases. And our clinical data research networks, again, about 117 institutions across the country and a real mix of different types of systems. So this slide, I think, has been shown today. This is the FDA slide on the National Evidence Generation infrastructure, and PCORNet does see itself as sort of part of that system in collaboration with FDA and NIH, and sort of looking at the many different networks that exist and are developing right now in the country. And so PCORNet sees itself as a key player in this national evidence generation infrastructure. I won't go over the PCORNet Common Data Model in a lot of detail. It's a very close cousin to the Sentinel Common Data Model by design, and that provides obvious advantages in terms of the collaboration. Although we've certainly had some challenges in organizing the EHR data in a system that was built originally for claims data. So here again is a little list of the tables. In blue you have the tables that exist, and in green the ones that are in development. Just a little update on sort of our size and where we're at in our development. So PCORNet really launched in January 2014, so we're a much younger cousin to Sentinel. We had some governance and just kind of implementation challenges in trying to implement the data strategy across such a large scale so quickly. But we have been successful. And this past year was really a critical year to organize. We have 82 data marts across the 13 CDRNs. They originally this summer characterized 7 tables, which are listed here, and they ran on our Common Data Model version 3. So that data characterization provided about 90 million patients with a medical encounter in the past 5 years. And that's about 42 million records that would support clinical trials and about 83 million records that would support observational studies. Here's a quick count of some conditions within PCORNet, just for interest. So don't think of these as rates. These are simply counts that we found across PCORNet at a point in time this summer. This January, we completed our Cycle 2 data characterization, which allowed us to add a number of tables, important tables, including prescribing and dispensing, lab results, and death. And so here are some early results from our January data characterization. We have about 94 million patients available for observational studies and about 46 million available for clinical trials. And sort of similar to the query times reported for Sentinel, many of these queries can run under 3 hours once the data is organized. 18% took more than 10 hours. We do have the VA in there, and so their query ran a little longer. This is just a quick table to give you a sense of the lab results. So the team at the Cornet Center prioritized some lab results, and sort of here's a sense of the counts that you might see. I can't actually read them from here, so I hope some of you can, and you'll have the slides afterwards. Same with medications. The team prioritized key medications and has started to look at both dispensing and prescribing data for these key medications. So PCORNet supports different types of research. We certainly have sort of the early prep to research type queries. We can support observational studies. But I think one of our most promising areas are the interventional studies. We're using the electronic health record to both identify eligible patients and then do electronic follow-up. So without burdening either the patients or the clinicians, seems to be a real promising and important venue for us. Our flagship trial is called Adaptable. It's a pragmatic trial comparing 2 different dosages of aspirin, and most of the work is done electronically through using the Common Data Model data, so electronic screening, electronic enrollment, electronic consent, and then electronic follow-up. So the main point to see about Adaptable is that while traditional cardiovascular trials recruit about 1 patient a month, you can see here in our top performers, we're recruiting as high as 30 patients per month in some of our sites. And so this approach of using the electronic data is really paying off in terms of our ability to recruit in a faster way for clinical trials. It's also much cheaper than a traditional cardiovascular trial. We're opening our front door for business in April, so there's more information for you on the website if you're interested in looking at that. Here's an important slide that talks about all the different collaborations we have. As I said, we are mainly an electronic health record-based system, so we do have collaborations underway with health plans to do data linkages, with CMS, with registries, with patient groups, and so we're exploring all kinds of different linkages right now to supplement the data in the EHR. I'm going to say 2 words about our collaborations with the FDA that Melissa mentioned. So we have 2 pilot projects. One is, and we heard a little bit about Zika this morning, but this is a different project. So one is congenital Zika syndrome surveillance, and then the second one is monitoring and reporting antimicrobial utilization. And so these are our 2 pilots with Sentinel that have really just kicked off this fall. And here's a little bit more information about the 2 projects that you can maybe peruse at your leisure because I'm running out of time. And I was asked to say a few words about our patient-powered research networks. So we have a very eclectic collection of patient-powered research networks. There's been a lot of lessons in sort of watching these groups organize and engage with patients and develop research agendas. I think the results are a mixed bag, but there's many lessons as we go into the future here. We have about 220,000 patients that have signed up to say they're interested in participating in generating questions and participating in research. Some of the areas to watch around our patient-powered research networks are whether recruitment to pragmatic trials and the interest of patients in participating in these trials is going to be higher because they've signed up already to be part of these patient networks. Another area of interest is the use of mobile health data for research. The idea that patients actually own their EHR data and can share it with researchers, and we're piloting some different apps there, and that's a little app up there called Hugo that we're exploring using for patients to be able to download their EHR data and then consent to share their data with researchers. And then we have a number of new initiatives starting in this spring around learning network pilots, and these are the idea that the patients and their clinicians work together with their delivery systems to really not only conduct research but also bring the results back into practice and really watch how patient outcomes are improving in that process. I think that's my last slide. Yep, that's my last slide. So thank you for your attention.
Rachel, thanks very much. We're now going to shift gears a little bit again. You heard this morning some about NEST and medical device surveillance, and Bill Murray is going to talk more about that.
Thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. This is an interesting opportunity for MDIC and NEST. You heard Greg Pappas talk this morning about some of the great work that's been happening in NEST. And back in September, MDIC was awarded a grant through CDRH to stand up the coordinating center for NEST for medical devices. And so this is, we're at the other end of the spectrum, if you will. So we're in this for about 6 months now, leveraging the work that's been done first through MD-EpiNet and some of the other FDA activities. And as we go forward, we'll talk a little bit about how we could, I think, leverage some of the Sentinel activities as well. So starting out with the coordinating center, just to give a little bit of historical background here. What we are charged with doing through the cooperative grant with FDA, followed with support from MEDUFA 4 funding, is to stand up a coordinating center and complete 3 demonstration projects to look at new clearances and approvals, expanded indications, as well as safety surveillance. So that already starts to expand beyond just the surveillance aspect, if you will. And it's clear to us that our strategy needed to be one of looking at the use of a federated network of data sources, and clearly Sentinel, PCORNet, other data sources will have to be leveraged for us. We have no interest or the capacity or the financial resources to build up those capabilities ourselves. What we do need to do for medical devices is we have to incorporate the and have a vision for the future on how unique device identifier linkage could be included, as well as procedure information, that especially as we look at product performance for devices. And I always like to use tangible examples. So as we've been out doing some landscape analysis and talking to some of the stakeholders, an example would be cardiac arrhythmias, where there's the label and the proved indication is for atrial arrhythmias, and there's data through the instrumentation that is used for ablations that would indicate that there's use for ventricular arrhythmias as well as another application. And so when we think about how to deploy linking, say, Sentinel data with that kind of procedural data, it's a great opportunity to, I think, inform and better understand the use and application of medical products, medical devices. So that's an example of how I think we can use this information going forward. It's going to be critical for us to find ways to leverage, as I said, data sources like Sentinel. We're very much in the early days of this effort. Where we are right now is we're establishing our governance structure. We actually are, I'll make an advertisement, I think our governing committee nominations close on Monday. So anybody that is thinking about nomination should get their nomination in here before Monday. And we're also in the process of searching for an executive director for the coordinating center, which I can assure you is something that I'm highly motivated since I'm doing 2 jobs at the moment. So I think I'll just I'll stop there and just say that this is a great opportunity for us to learn and absorb and to take some of what are I consider best practices that are being used in Sentinel and other places, and leverage that into what we're doing at the coordinating center.
Thanks very much, Bill. Now we're going to hear from Catherine about the NIH Healthcare Systems Research Collaboratory.
Thank you very much, Mark. And again, thank you for including me on the panel today. I think it's been a rather robust discussion of the incredible progress this program has made over the last several years. So I'm delighted to talk to you a little bit about an effort at the NIH called the NIH Healthcare Systems Research Collaboratory, which has been working over the last few years to leverage these resources from our sister agency at FDA in order to consider how such tools could be used to further biomedical research. On the collaboratory program, it was initially funded in 2012 and is supported by the NIH Common Fund out of the Office of the Director. And an overall goal of the program is really to strengthen the national capacity to implement cost-effective, large-scale clinical trials that really engage healthcare system organizations as research partners. With several aims, overall, the implementation methods and best practices that enable this kind of research embedded within healthcare systems is really a focal point of the program. And in my comments today, as we talk about methods and best practices for tools that are developed along the way, either within the program or those developed with other resources, such as those within the Sentinel program. This is a map of the trials that have been launched within the NIH Collaboratory. The focus of these efforts are really on pragmatic clinical trials. And since 2012, we have funded a collaboratory coordinating center, which is staffed and housed at Duke University, but also Rich Platt's team at Harvard has been a very important participant and investigator in helping to plan and implement these trials. So 9 trials have been launched across the U.S., which span many different disciplines. And unlike some of the efforts we've heard about today, the collaboratory is not in and of itself a network. Each of these investigators bring their clinical trial with their own data partners, many of whom have 1 to 4 different healthcare systems that are working collaboratively, if you will, in performing the pragmatic clinical trials. Here's a list of many of the healthcare system partners that are engaged in the 9 trials that are currently operational, many of the healthcare systems with which you're familiar. We also have dialysis and nursing home providers that are participating in this, OCHIN as well as the VA hospitals. So quite an array of different kinds of data partners that have come together, and many of these working with other healthcare systems within the context of an individual trial. And here we have a screenshot from the website for the Collaboratory Coordinating Center. And of course, the Collaboratory Distributed Research Network, or DRN, as you know, is led by Rich Platt, and of course, the picture here on the website of Jeff Brown and Leslie Curtis, who provide quite a bit of expertise to the Coordinating Center's activities for the DRN. And over the last couple of years, the DRN team at the Coordinating Center has worked quite extensively with investigators, many at the NIH, in terms of developing methods that are being developed in order to facilitate a greater use of this very powerful resource that Sentinel has developed. Here's a slide of vision. I'm sure that folks have seen this before, where we have the sharing of infrastructure that's been created within different organizations and across organizations, and that each organization participates in multiple networks, and that each network controls its governance and its coordination, and that the networks share infrastructure, data curation, analytics lessons, security, and software development. So there's quite a bit of learning that's ongoing within these systems. And again, bringing together discrete communities of experts who have very different skill sets, which has been critical in making all of this work. So as the collaboratory DRN data partners have been working with the coordinating center team, several of the existing Sentinel partners have been working on a pilot program that was initiated by many of the scientists at NIH that are involved in the collaboratory program. And indeed, some of these data partners are participants in the pragmatic trials that are currently running within the collaboratory program itself. And this is my last slide to talk a little bit about what's been happening and to give folks an update on the DRN program in the Collaboratory since last year. Over the last couple of years, we've run a pilot project of 3 queries from NIH scientists that are kicking the tires, if you will, and trying to understand how one develops queries, what are the appropriate processes that are important. And along the way, we've developed guidance documents, training materials, application processes, ways of reaching out, ultimately reaching out to the research community for greater familiarity on how to and on how to use such a tool for certainly at the beginning for research planning. And in 2017, indeed, just last week, the website posted the bottom half, which is a screen site from the Collaboratory website, which is a broader outreach to the research community. There's now an application process for investigators that would like to query the DRN to begin asking questions that can either for which there might be a discrete answer, or more specifically, pulling the investigative community into a dialogue about how to plan for future trials, and that things that can be useful for ultimately writing an application for a clinical trial, leveraging the information within the Sentinel data partners. And I think in closing, I guess there are 2 lessons that we've learned as we've gone through these pilot questions with scientists and as we engage our investigative community on this is one, and certainly I think Robert mentioned this previously, this is clearly an iterative process with our investigators. We're bringing together different communities. We have the clinical researchers who have questions and answers that they'd like, and then we have the DRN team who understand the data structure, its elements, and its limitations. And so with this, when we have a query that appears simple, it still may take a couple rounds of querying in order to get to the answer. And it certainly becomes more interesting when the questions are more than simple counts, but that we get to more complicated or complex questions that we'd like to ask of the data set. So I think that there's been much learning along the way, and we've developed processes and a guidance document and a way for investigators to get into this conversation now. And I think that we'll certainly be learning a lot as we push the community to think about this as a planning tool for future trials. And that's really been the focus now in getting the community educated on what the tool is and how it might best be used. And I think I'll stop there, Mark. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you very much. So we've heard about a wide range of activities to generate better evidence, fundamentally better evidence as part of a learning healthcare system. We now have some time for questions and comments that you all might have about this broad and important topic that builds on the efforts of the Sentinel Initiative. So if there are questions, please get ready to ask them. I'd like to start off this discussion by doing sort of the big picture question about taking stock of where we are and where we're headed. I think in one form or another, a lot of times today, Catherine, most recently in your presentation, we saw a slide showing this notion of shared infrastructure for multiple purposes, where across a lot of these different applications, there's some key common elements like needing curated data and increasingly data that's linked together and curated. Health systems claims, for example, or data generated from patients. There's a need for consistent and validated models that can be run at each participating organization or node in these activities. And those do seem to overlap a lot, potentially. But on top of that, for particular types of applications, there's a need for a governance process that all the participants, patients, the organizations have confidence in. For Sentinel, that's been an effort led by FDA, but with broad participation. All these other activities are either have or, in Bill's case, are developing them. And then finally, some kind of financial support. There's a combination of interests of particular users, but often a public good piece of this. The FDA support for core support for Sentinel, for example, has been very important, and similarly the NIH core support. So we seem to have some real common elements across a lot of these activities. What's next? Are we missing something about how to leverage this potential much more effective shared infrastructure to develop it more quickly, to achieve more? What can we do to facilitate more progress?
I mean, I can mention at FDA there's been lots of discussion around what we've called an evidence generation collaborative, and really, kind of building towards the learning healthcare system we've been talking about, and some of the things that you've referenced, acknowledging that a lot of these activities are going on by many private organizations. There's other government agencies that are developing these infrastructures, and the goal should be to leverage them all for a common purpose, or for a purpose that fits our needs, and take advantage of the strengths of the different systems for different uses. So there's been some discussion. I guess I would invite everybody to check out on the FDA website. There's a page that talks a little bit about this vision and where we'd like to see things go in the next 5 years, and the opportunities to work collaboratively to seeing better use of electronic healthcare data for not only observational studies, but for prospective randomized designs to better integrate the healthcare that's given to patients and clinical care with healthcare research to inform how those patients can make the best decisions with and better use all the evidence that we have in front of us. There's lots of data that's collected about individual interactions with the healthcare system that just really isn't optimized and informing future activities.
We didn't talk a whole lot about this, but the whole massive movement in digital health, I think, is going to have an impact and transform even how we're thinking about things in the next few years. And as we look at what that means, not only for the infrastructure and the systems we have, but how patients can be empowered, and how much more informed and how much more empowered they may be in both access to and potentially having a stronger voice and ownership of their data, and what that means for healthcare providers and the decision process as well. So I think, as we go forward, I anticipate a much stronger, I think, engagement and voice from patients because of the digital health revolutions that's happening.
We talked a little bit about applications that are based on patients having their own electronic record data, maybe other sources of data, so that's a direct mechanism for participating in. There's still the need for curating that data and combining it effectively using valid methods, but I think that's a really good point about potential ways of both generating more support for these activities and new sources of need for engagement, and PCORNet's been doing a lot of work in that direction too. Any other thoughts?
I think for me, one of the biggest lessons in terms of how we move forward is that incentives have to be aligned for all the participants, and by incentives I don't just mean the dollars, just kind of the value proposition has to be there for everyone that's at the table, from industry to the research community to the health plans to the patients to the providers, and so once I think everyone has a seat at the table and is able to sort of collaborate in that way to move this forward, I think it will move forward much faster. The technical piece now is possible. The future is here technically. The governance piece, I think, are starting to be worked out. But in order for us to really have this national evidence generation platform, each stakeholder has to find its own sort of value proposition to be part of that.
Hi, I'm Brian Miller. I'm a reviewer in the Office of New Drugs, and my question does not reflect the views of OND or CDER or the FDA. With that disclosure aside, So I do pre and post-market safety review, and I guess I think about my mother's constant chiding of me as a child to make sure that I spend my allowance wisely. So by the time a paper ends up on my desk that I read, it maybe costs that investigator $500,000, or if it's a pre-market data set, maybe it costs the sponsor $100 million by the time it gets to me. So my question is, how can we use these tools in order to lower the cost of development or post-market surveillance?
Good. Yeah. I would probably be in a different position if I could answer that question fully, but I'll give it a go. I mean, the way I'm thinking about in terms of drug development, let's use a concrete example, is that when we're conducting clinical trials, as you know well, we often see rare events. Right now, we don't have, and we don't know how to interpret those rare events because there's so few of them, and they may be spread across the two comparative groups. A tool like IMEDS will actually could potentially help us rapidly understand what the background rate is, conduct observed expected analyses, and that may or may not make the difference between moving forward with a trial and this could happen both in the pre-approval or in the post-approval space. And that's just a very simple example where I can imagine we don't have access to that type of data very quickly because right now there really are not data sources that are large enough to ask some of these questions that we want to ask to support drug development. So in theory, that might make it cheaper, might make it faster. In the post-approval arena, I think it's more obvious, right, how being able to enhance these modules that already exist are going to make it much faster. They make it cheaper because you are already working off an existing platform to do post-approval studies, which currently we're either using in a database, if we can do it in a database, or more often we're working with clinical registries or creating entire new data systems because, again, maybe there's an issue of size or we don't have access to medical records in some of the commercially available databases. So, the tool offers a lot of advantages, in particular in the post-approval space, that are going to make it much cheaper to do PMRs and much faster. So, yeah, I mean, that's just a start.
I mean, I think also, and Rachel touched upon this, and PCORNet, and I think we're learning this through Impact AFib also. It helps us identify patients that appear to meet the inclusion and exclusion criteria. I mean, that's a big stumbling block for getting development programs started, is finding the right patients that seem like they can be in your study. I think it helps you understand the population better. So I think there's lots of opportunities to understand kind of exactly what populations look like, what patients are taking what other drugs, and understanding how to design a protocol that's more efficient. So, I mean, I think we're going to continue to learn these types of things, and I think that's a lot of what these different programs are seeking to do, is to identify where there's opportunities to take advantage of this existing data to create efficiencies in clinical trial conduct.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I'd add to all that is obviously Sentinel sort of set this benchmark for transparency, and I think that transparency, which has been carried forward into kind of all of these other networks that we're talking about, it actually enables sort of essentially a community knowledge repository to sort of grow up so that, for instance, every question that Robert just talked about, maybe out of that total that he's dealing with, there's one or two that were recently answered and recently posted, and he has the transparency to be able to evaluate how those questions were asked and parameterized, and the confidence in the data output to then make inferences from that. And so there could be some further cost savings there, that instead of like two different entities really in some sense asking the same question in fairly close temporal period, someone can leverage other work that is available and that's trusted.
And I'd just say from medical devices quickly, the sophistication and complexity of devices continues to increase, And the expectation of understanding and the level of clinical evidence is going to also increase. So the paradigm of today can't continue. It's not a sustainable model, so there has to be a new approach. And so I see this as not an option. I think it's absolutely a necessity.
In the case of medical devices, that's what led to the medical device user fee agreement around investing in this effort. There's expected to be a significant return in both the quality of the evidence on medical device effectiveness as well as safety, and also a much reduced cost of generating that evidence. So high expectations. And let me follow up, great question, follow up with one more harder on top of this. So we've talked about the potential value proposition and ways to meet it through leveraging these different systems that can create infrastructures that are useful for multiple purposes. One other way to do more, to make more progress faster, is to bring down the cost of doing these large-scale network studies. And I know you all, there's been a lot of work going into this. Costs seem to be coming down. We've heard about some of those opportunities today. Any thoughts about the next best opportunities to make this kind of infrastructure work cheaper and more efficient to conduct?
So, I'm not sure I'm the best person to be answering this question, but I do think that a lot of the funding that I think that FDA puts out is around data quality. And I think as our experience and understanding of the data matures and we're able to kind of optimize that process, I can imagine that would be a very good place that we'll start to see savings in the future, especially if we're all working with the same data. I mean, I think that's the biggest value is if it's checked once, it can be used by many. And if FDA is investing a lot of funding in there, there's no reason for somebody else to be doing that similarly. So I think that to the extent that we can take advantage of those by using what other partners are developing and investing in, it saves us money and gets us a wider range. So, if where Rachel talks about her data that's largely EHR, that's very unique and complements Sentinel activities, and that's some of the reasons that we've tried to work together. And to think about ways that we can say, well, Sentinel here is a largely claims database. PCORNet has invested largely in an EHR database. What if we, were to answer questions or look at them from different perspectives? How could we get a better, more refined answer?
Thank you. Rachel?
I'll just say a few words about pragmatic trials. So the adaptable clinical trial that I mentioned is about an $18 million trial for 20,000 patients, which by regular standards is sort of a small amount. Having said that, there has been a significant amount of investment in PCORNet to enable the support of a trial at that cost. So for PCORNet to be able to really deliver on the promise of cheaper pragmatic trials, we now need to be able to fund a significant number of these types of pragmatic trials so that we can sustain the original investment. So I think we're at the cusp of that in the time frame where the big investment has been made. We've launched a governance structure. We've organized the data in a way that allows trials at that cost to be run. But now we really need the volume of research to be able to sustain that initial investment. So I think for us, the cheaper trials are certainly possible, but this is the point where we really kind of need to pivot into being able to support the infrastructure that's being built.
Yeah. Thank you. Go ahead, Catherine.
And I guess on cost for pragmatic trials and follow-up, the NIH experience with this first group of 9 studies that are launched all largely with a budget of about $7 million over a 5-year period, which for large-scale trials at the NIH is
for those of you who think that's a big number,
is a bit lean.
Look at the cost of a clinical trial.
Because the sample sizes for most of these trials are anywhere from 1,000 to 300,000 or 400,000 subjects that are enrolled in the studies. And so we've found that there really is economies of scale as many of the interventions are embedded within usual clinical practice within the healthcare systems that are participating in the studies. And so we have seen that with this particular model and implementation of these methods that costs for pragmatic trials are less than what we see per patient costs in a more explanatory trial.
Thank you. And Heather, you get the last question.
Oh, good. Heather Colvin with the Duke Margolis Center. And one of the critical communities that I think that we haven't really tapped into yet, and this is building on our work with medical devices, and also building on Steve Makita's presentation from earlier, is the clinical community. I mean, there is lots of work going on in updating standards of clinical care, and if we could tap into Sentinel to better understand the care cascade, particularly in areas where there are new innovative therapeutic options coming on the market, I think it would be very important for them to see the impact. One, first, to better understand, are we following the standards of care that are out there? Two, with the interventions or new interventions coming into place, how does this improve quality of care across the board? And I think that that's a stakeholder that I would love to see kind of engaged. And I think by talking to different people out there, what I found is that by and large, the clinical community is unaware of Sentinel. And so I think that we, as part of this larger engagement effort, should definitely tap into them, because I think that they would have not only an interest in the outcomes, but also in investing in the infrastructure.
Comments on that? There are some initial steps, like the anticoagulation study that you mentioned. That's about kind of finding patients in the community that are at risk and seeing what interventions work. And if you want to comment about further steps there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good thing to have on our radar. I thought it was very exciting to hear about all the work that Steve and his group had done around engagement, and I know they have plans to focus also on providers. I think the angle that you're coming at or that you're bringing up is a little different than, more of an awareness, but I think it kind of touches on what Rachel was saying, is how do you get everybody engaged with getting or wanting to be part of this and contributing, and how do you bring them to table, and what is their incentive? And I think that it's true that the success of what we all see of a broader evidence generation system, providers and clinicians are key to that happening. And so to thinking about what would incentivize their participation is something we should start, engaging with them around now.
I think our experience from just in the implementation of pragmatic trials with the obvious multiple stakeholders that are necessary for these studies to be successful, that clinicians are an integral part, and at times a difficult community to reach, surprisingly, within some of the healthcare systems. And I think that there have been many lessons learned about how to do this well and better with future studies. And I think we really need to continue this kind of outreach.
Right.
For medical devices, it's absolutely critical because of the procedure-based aspects of many of the therapies. So clearly it's an important constituency. As we think about it in the context of Sentinel, we need to get that linkage with UDI and procedures so that we're able to kind of bring that integrated view together, because that's important for the physician community. So registries tend to, I think, dominate right now in our world, but in the future this will be an important part.
All right. Well, I don't want anyone to get up quite yet, but I do want to thank our panel for an excellent discussion to wrap up today's meeting. Thank you all very much. Now, and while you're sitting tight for just one more minute, I want to turn to thanking all of you. This is, as we talked about at the beginning, this is the 9th annual Sentinel workshop and conference to discuss progress and future plans for the Sentinel initiative. As you heard this afternoon, a wide range of activities that are extending and emanating from it. It really is an interesting time for the program, where on the one hand, clearly a whole lot has been accomplished, but at the same time, we're not nearly at the end of the road. If you think about goals like Rachel just described of an evidence-generating, truly learning healthcare system, but we're certainly marching down that road with a lot of opportunity and momentum for further progress, thanks to how Sentinel has fit into these overall efforts. Many of you in this room, just like many of the people on Rich's credit slide earlier today, have been contributing to this effort. This is truly truly a public-private partnership that will not succeed without the inclusion of a wide range of stakeholder perspectives and good ideas and willingness to partner to try to do things differently and more effectively. So it's a real privilege for us at Duke-Margolis to be part of this overall effort, but most importantly, it wouldn't happen without all of you. So I want to thank everyone here in person and online for attending. The materials from this event, along with the webcast, will be available on our website. And then I want to give a special thanks to a few others on top of the long list that you've heard about that have made this possible today, just for making this this conference possible. Our partners at FDA, Aaron Neiman, Michael Nguyen, Carlos Bell, and Azadeh Shoalbi, who have worked closely with us over the last year for planning the content and the presentations here. And then last, our team at Duke, Heather Colvin, Adam Atten, Isha Sharma, and Joanna Klatzman, and Greg Daniel for all of their efforts to put this together. Thank you all very much for joining us, and thanks especially for your interest and commitment and action on improving evidence and the safety and effectiveness of healthcare products and healthcare. Thank you all very much.